The meeting tonight is on the secret state and will be introduced by John Rees. The format will be much the same as the local SWP branch meetings. John will speak for about 35 minutes and then there'll be time for contributions, questions and discussion, and then after that John will come back and sum the meeting up. So if I ask John to kick the meeting off.
Okay, comrades. With the right trial in Australia, the moves to stop and ban the zircon film in this country, and even with the off home from Moscow, it's obvious that the issue's in the news. I mean, even if you want to avoid the issue, you can't really avoid the issue of the secret state. I mean, you go away, think, what should I do? Turn on the television, watch a nice film. What have you got this year? Another country, an Englishman abroad, the blunt thing, and then you know that really, even though perhaps it isn't something which revolutionaries spend a lot of time thinking about, that there on their shelves, beside the Lenin and the Trotsky, there's Le Carré and Len Dayton and all the rest of it. So perhaps it is something which is a little bit worthwhile looking at. The right certainly find it a very potent ideological weapon. For them, the whole question of state secrecy and spies and related issues is a tremendously powerful ideological weapon. It's the whole issue of patriotism, and those people who aren't patriots are traitors, and you can, try and whip up as much kind of venom and sort of moral opprobrium directed at the traitors as you like. And then there's the whole question of national security and the rivalry with other nations, nationalism at the heart of it, and then of course there's the enemy within and a necessity, therefore, as they see it, to have secrecy at home. It's something from which they can draw a fantastic amount of political capital. And of course, it's not just that those issues are separate for them. They also like to knit them together. It's always been, a favourite ideological weapon of the right wing. If they can stick together the idea of traitors and of spies and of the left, then they really think that they're cooking. Of course, that used to be easier than it is now. The Communist Party used to provide, the ideal enemy as far as the secret services and the state were concerned. It was both left-wing and linked to a foreign power, and what's more, the foreign power as far as they were concerned, Moscow and Moscow gold. It was an absolute gift. It's more difficult for them now because Communist Party is much weaker, that what remains of it is distancing itself a little bit from the old style Stalinism, although I see that the actual operation on the ground didn't alter much at the Gramsci 87 thing earlier in the month, and therefore they find it a little bit more difficult. But even so, they still try and make the attempt. I noticed that in Len Dayton's latest spy novel, one of the arch villains, one of the Moscow spies, is carting around a copy of Socialist Worker in a hotel room for some completely unexplained reason. And perhaps that isn't so far-fetched because, as often in some of the things that you'll see, the fact is much stranger than the fiction. The MI5, for instance, had the International Marxist Group, Orthodox Trotskyist organisation, listed as a Moscow front organisation during the early 1970s. Now I know that the theory of the degenerated workers' state is softer on Russia than we are, but even so, I think it's stretching a point to make them into a Moscow front organisation. But those themes, that theme of the external threat, the foreign power, Moscow at the heart of everything, and the left, those two have been the motivating forces really behind the secret services ever since they were formed. They were formed really both, they were formed as a result, in this country certainly, in the first decades of the century, formed out of a increasing tension internationally, the drive towards the First World War, the increasing competition between the rival imperialisms, and the rising level of class struggle at home. That was what, in 1909, the first head of MI5 the Internal Security Service, cited as being the reasons. In fact, there was a whole wave of quite hysterical literature aimed, really, drifting towards war. There are arguments, reports about the weakness, the physical weakness of recruits into the army and how that needed to be built up. Baden-Powell formed the Scouts organisation because he thought that the youth were becoming too weak and pathetic to be able to fight the Hun, and therefore it was necessary to build them up. And out of that and novels which sold in millions, saying that there was a threat of a German invasion and of spy scares throughout the country, there was an hysteria whipped up around the whole question. Obviously, as you can see looking back in the drive towards the First World War, and from that were born the British security organisations, MI5 and MI6, and in 1911 the Official Secrets Act was passed, a fantastically broad act which can be used against, for instance, if you publicise pictures of certain listed buildings, one of them being Her Majesty's Stationery Office in Holborn, you're liable to prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. I don't know whether people saw this book, for instance, One Girl's War, which is, as I'll quote some later, it's completely innocuous little book, one woman's memoirs of her time in MI5. That is banned in this country. There's absolutely nothing secret in it. But the catch-all conditions of the Official Secrets Act, born out of that period of hysteria, nevertheless have banned it still in this country. That fear reached its peak in the first months after the First World War broke out. MI5 had 1,000 suspected spy cases reported every day of the first 6 months of the war. All of them, virtually all of them, were complete and utter hoaxes. But you can see that beneath that was the kind of thing which pushed the secret services into being. It was the same story actually in Russia. The Okhrana, the Tsar's outfit, spying outfit, was born. The political police in Russia was born, first of all set up in the 1880s, but really only became a serious organisation in 1900. And you begin to see in the major imperial powers the same thing happened. At the same time, there were novels selling in millions about spy scares and invasion threats in this country, giving rise to a mood where the security service was set up. The same thing was happening in Germany. And there were groups of young students. One particular instance is recorded in the annals of the German spy network, where they stopped and searched suspicious foreigners on the way out of Germany in 1910. They caught hold of one particularly unfortunate British nurse and strip searched her. They strip searched her and found that she had what they thought was secret writing printed on her arse. So they whipped her straight off to the headquarters of the German Secret Service to have it analysed. It turned out that for sanitary reasons she sat on the toilet on that day's copy of a leading German newspaper, and the print had been retained there. That was one of the things which gave a real fear to the German ruling class, such that they set up the spy organisation in Germany at the time. That was the origins of it. But at its origins, it had a hallmark which it's never really lost in this country. MI5 and MI6 never really lost, and that is that it's a tiny, self-selecting clique from inside the ruling class. Always has been, still is largely selected on the basis of who knows who. Largely selected in the pre-Second World War period, from London clubs, from the public schools, from people who knew people who were the right sort of people. They were the only people who really got selected to go into the Secret Service, and it was run on a fantastically amateurish basis. Peter Wright says that even when he joined the organisation in the pre-war period, he said that the analysis room, where the laboratory, he said it was schoolboy stuff. Their laboratory, he said he'd had a better laboratory when he was at school than the one that he found inside the Secret Service. It was a tiny, tiny ruling class group of people. At one point, in actual fact, the head of MI5, the head of MI6, the head of MI5 counter-espionage, and one other person, Anthony Blunt, were all actually family relations of one another inside the Secret Service. And because of that, it had a fantastically kind of hothouse atmosphere about it. I mean, they were people who often didn't fit in to the core institutions of the ruling class. People who couldn't find a niche anywhere else found themselves a home in the Secret Service. Certainly in the early days, they were eccentrics of the First Order. So Mansfield Cummings, the first head of MI6, used to interview recruits for the organisation, and midway through the interview would suddenly whip out a knife and stab his own leg to test their reactions. They weren't to know it was a wooden leg, but he felt that this was in some way a test of their reactions. He also used to make his way around the headquarters of MI6 on a child's scooter, which he found easier with his wooden leg. Now, I mean, these people, are not going to be, a key part of the British state. I mean, the head of MI5, Vernon Cowell, the first head of MI5, was virulently anti-homosexual, which didn't stop his organisation seemingly recruiting a far higher percentage than the normal percentage in the population, but nevertheless virulently anti-gay, and said of the women agents that the only women that he could conceive being agents in his organisation were those that were well bred and had good legs. Now, I realise that the British ruling class has always had difficulty telling the difference between horses and women, but it does seem pronounced that you have somebody who's supposed to be heading a prestigious part of the British state machine holds ideas like this. They were people really who believed that spying was Rudyard Kipling's great game. In fact, one of the key recruiters was the sort of patriotic novelist John Buchan, who wrote the 39 Steps, was one of the early recruiters for MI5. It's always had that characteristic of being a self-selecting, tiny, eccentric clique within the ruling class. Mansfield Cummings, man, that I've just talked about, in fact, wrote a diary of books that was given to recruits to MI6, instructing them on various disguises which he used to obtain from the theatrical suppliers, on various disguises that they might use. There was also a section on how to use secret inks. One of the secret inks which he suggested his agents use was semen. Now, don't ask me how they were meant to do this, but anyway, this was the instruction in the book. I presume he, therefore, was simultaneously the inventor of the French letter and the first self-sealing envelope. But I apologise for getting a little tacky, so I'll avoid any more. But you can see that you can see the type of people. Let me describe to you how Joan Miller, for instance, the woman who wrote this book, still banned in this country, how she describes her own recruitment to MI5. What are the things that she thinks got her recruited? She says, "My social standing was in my favour, I suppose, and so were the references I was able to plug from top-ranking service officers, one in my own family and one friend, and from the Dame of Sark." Now, these were the things which got you recruited to supposedly the key intelligence organisation in this country. And how was she recruited? She received a telegram which told her to go and stand outside the Natural History Museum and wait for an unnumbered bus to pull up. She did so. It pulled up, and she said, "I found the bus parked opposite the Natural History Museum. Some girls, like myself, were already on board, got up, like me, in the ex-private schoolgirl's daytime uniform, grey flannel skirt, lambswool jersey, and a single string of pearls. A couple of youngish men in bowler hats reading newspapers sat near the front. Nobody spoke. Ignorance of the correct way to behave, I presume." Now, you imagine that you're in what is still, at this point, it's 1938, still one of the most powerful, imperialist economies in the world. You're building an intelligence organisation which has grown from very small origins before the First World War to the point where it now involves thousands of people. And you're still recruiting, on the word of the Dame of Stark, on an unnumbered bus outside the Natural History Museum, and your fellow recruits are all wearing a single string of pearls and a grey lambswool jersey. I mean, is this a serious way to run an intelligence organisation? And even though, 100 years after the other key parts of the British state machine were overhauled and made into relatively meritocratic organisations which at least recruited from the upper reaches of the middle class, even 100 years after, even when it was reformed, it still retained some of those characteristics. When Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean defected in 1951, a friend, the novelist Rosamund Lehman, phoned the director of MI5 and said that she urgently wanted to speak to him, that she had some information about Burgess which he might find interesting. Could they possibly meet? She received a telephone reply which said, "I'd love to hear your information, I'm very interested, but unfortunately I have to take my children to Ascot today, so I can't meet you." Now, all the way through, even when the security service was reformed, even when it was put on a more serious basis, even when there was an attempt to overcome the amateurism and the cliquishness, there was still that element running through the whole organisation. The difference really in the post-war period, the difference increasingly in the post-war period, was that the British Empire was in rapid decline, that the British capitalist class was no longer a premier capitalist class, and its security service really became very bitter, very internalised, very. If you think about the origin, there's been so much ink spilt about Burgess and Maclean and Kim Philby, but the origin, really the explanation, is fantastically simple and fantastically clear. That they were a group of people who grew up during the 1930s, who could see the utter failure of their own ruling class in the mass unemployment and the poverty at home, who were fantastically aware of the threat of fascism abroad. Philby himself had been in the Spanish Civil War. They were people who, even though they were very much part of the ruling class, they came from impeccable ruling class backgrounds. Nevertheless, they were people who couldn't stomach what had happened during the 1930s, and that's why, in a sense, part of the reflection of security services that you read in Le Carre's novels, the one element of it which really rings truer than anything else, is the fact that nobody really in that world has any ideals, has any real belief in the goals that they're pursuing, and that really, is as much a condemnation of the whole of the British ruling class in the post-war period as it is specifically of the security services. So that's the kind of people, the kind of methods of organisation. It's a long way from the kind of super efficient, ruthless spies, endlessly protecting us from foreign threat that you read about in the press. In fact, most of the information that the security services get isn't actually from their own spying activities. Most of the information they get, in fact, in the 1950s and the 1960s, every single piece of information worth anything that MI5 or MI6 got came from defectors. And if you think about that, that in itself is a statement about the way that our world works. Because if you look at the defectors, by and large, they're people who have become sickened by the workings of their own system, who see that the grass might possibly be greener on the other side of the hill, who desert their own system in the hope of being able to purchase a life there. And then by and large, when they get there, whether they go from west to east or from east to west, They are fantastically, if you saw, a few months back, the stories about one of the Soviet defectors who not immediately, but fairly rapidly attempted to go back. If you saw some of the documentaries on television about the lives that people who have defected live in the United States, then you see that by and large they're quite sad, quite despondent, quite disillusioned exiles who found that the world that they thought embodied all the virtues which their society didn't have is actually different, but as corrupt, as debased, as horrible as the world that they left behind. It's from those people, really very, very sad, very, very sad cases, very, very sad illustrations of what happens in the superpower rivalries. From those people that the vast majority of any information that the security services get comes. There's one other source which has been valuable to them, and that is that much of the information they gather comes from specialist journals, from specialist magazines, from publications of different institutions which are openly available. They certainly organise the people who have the time to go through it, to collate the information, to cross-check the information, but a lot of it. I mean, that's one of the things really which Duncan Campbell showed absolutely brilliantly with the Zircon spy film, that the information is there if you know where to look, if you're persistent enough in looking, and if you're capable of collating the information that you get from different sources at the end of the day. Now, the other source of information, really, for the last 10 or 15 years, the key source of information is not at all from the dirty Mac and Trilby brigade, from any actual spy. Actually, most of it comes from satellite intelligence, electronic intelligence of one description or another. That's where the information comes from. It comes from defectors, it comes from specialist magazines and the people who analyse them, it comes from electronic intelligence. Very little of it comes from the kind of people that were talked about in the spy novels and all the rest of it. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons why Duncan Campbell has become such an enemy as far as the British ruling class is concerned, because he was one of the first people in the London listings magazine Time Out in the 70s, under a Labour government, more of which I'll come on to. He's one of the first people to really expose the role of GCHQ in electronic intelligence. He's one of the people, and obviously with the Zircon film, he put his finger on precisely that area once again. So really, what I'm saying about the security services is that they've always and still do come from a very narrow clique of people. They've always been slightly separate, by no means part of the core. They're not the inner sanctum of the ruling class. They're not the political masters of the situation. They're not the force behind the scene. Actually, they're a rather marginal, rather auxiliary, for a large part of their existence, rather amateur group of people, most of whose information isn't particularly devastatingly secret at all, and much of whose time is spent operating against trade unionists, against people on the left, against people in CND, and are not against any particular foreign threat at all. But even then, even with that information, even given those situations, it's also important to note that what they do, the information that they get and what they say, isn't a determinant, isn't a key determinant by any means in what happens politically. They're the political servants. They're the political underdog, not the political top dog. I'll give you three examples, really. One from Russia, that Stalin's chief intelligence bureaucrat, really. He wasn't a spy in any sense. He was somebody who collated the information. A man called Golikov was responsible for producing digests of the information produced by Russian intelligence and giving them to Stalin. Now, Stalin wasn't a man that he was willing to cross very easily. He wasn't, in fact, willing to give Stalin very much information which he knew would contradict Stalin's ideas. But he wasn't somebody either who was stupid enough simply to tear up the files. So what he did was, anything which he knew, any report which he knew would contradict Stalin's already formed ideas, he wrote unreliable source on, and any report which he thought would bolster Stalin's already conceived ideas, he would write reliable report on. Stalin would read both reports. The unreliable report would come back marked on file and got stuffed away in the files, so that if at any point in the future that proved to be correct, it could be pulled out and said, yes, but we showed you the report. But nevertheless, it wasn't the one that determined the policy. Even though the information might be there, even though it might be true, even though it might be useful, it wasn't necessarily acted on because it didn't fit in with the strategy of Stalin or the Russian ruling class. Similarly, with this country, with MI6, who had information, quite detailed information, including the possible date within a week of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor at the outset of the event anyway that brought the Americans into the Second World War. But they thought that if they gave the information or attempted to give the information straight to the White House, that they would be accused of trying to break America's isolationism, that they would be accused of trying to drag America into the war and of using the report or fabricating the report for that reason. So they decided that they wouldn't do that. They decided that they'd hand it, first of all, to J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. Hoover was suspicious of the agent who produced the report, didn't believe that it was actually that it was actually a genuine report, buried the report, and it never got outside the files of the FBI. The CIA's experience in Vietnam was very, very similar. They wrote reports initially which said that the cherished domino theory, the idea that if Vietnam fell, then there would be other states in Southeast Asia that would fall as well. They wrote reports saying that they didn't really believe that, and nothing happened. They wrote a report saying that the policy of withdrawing the American troops and substituting Vietnam nationals in their place, the Vietnamization policy, wasn't working. But that didn't get taken any notice of either. They wrote a report saying that there was massive corruption inside the South Vietnamese army, but that didn't get anywhere either. In fact, what happened is reported by a man called John Stockwell, who was a CIA agent at the time, and he says that if we sent them in, if we sent the reports, he said, then they would be sent back to us. If we persisted, they would put notes on our personal files. The head of the case officer in Washington was saying, in effect, that Washington had decreed that Vietnamization was working, and it would be disloyal to report that it wasn't. And so they simply stopped sending the reports. It wasn't the Secret Service. It isn't the Secret Service which determines those things. It's actually the policy of the ruling class as a whole, and they tend to select what they think bolsters their case from the reports given to them by the Secret Service, and to ignore the rest of it. I think that's important. It's an important point to make, because quite a lot of the left sees demons where the Secret Services are concerned. I went to the meeting that in London. There was a series of meetings around the country when the Zircon film was banned, at which the film was shown, at which people spoke. I went to the meeting where Tony Benn spoke in London, and really the reaction was not, I think, untypical of much of the left. There was a complete, there's a feeling of paranoia about the security services, a feeling, in Ben's eyes, that the CIA were in some way behind it all, that it was the Americans that were to blame, and that certainly the sense that the security services were some key and essential part of the state was very prominent in the meetings. People remember the strong state theory, which was canvassed, by many on the left when Thatcher seemed all powerful before the miners' strike. The idea that some way, the state had become something which it was impossible for the working class to fight against, that the power of the state, its power of surveillance, its power to in the police force was some way, had some way developed to such a pitch that the left could no longer really, or the working class could no longer hope to win against it. Those series, that current of ideas, is really quite strong, and the activities of the security service go some way to bolster that up. And zircon, the banning of zircon, and I think also the exposure of what MI5 did to the Wilson government in the course of the Wright case, I think has been used to that, because the Wright, Peter Wright's story seems to be something which every socialist's worst fears about the security service come to life. After all, I mean, Wright has really given the basis for explaining what happened in the early 70s, middle 70s against the Wilson government. He says that there was something like 30 MI5 officers being used to run an operation against the Wilson government. That there were plans to try and operate some kind of coup. If you see a report by Barry Penrose in The Observer, where he said that the head of the Cunard shipping line was woken up in the middle of the night in 1975 and asked if he would be willing to allow the QE2 to be used as a floating prison for the Wilson government. I mean, you can see possibly we may use it for that in the future. But I mean, these people were not having anything like that in mind. That the MI5 produced mock Labour Party leaflets, that they ran a black propaganda campaign out of Northern Ireland, that they spread rumours that Wilson was a Soviet spy, that his private secretary was a Soviet spy, that there was a communist cell inside number 10 Downing Street, that there were 30 Labour MPs who were communist agents, one of which on the list incidentally was Neil Kinnock. So it's not only Harold Wilson, but now Neil Kinnock is this was what Wright, and in the British press over the course of the Wright case, it's been attempted to portray Wright as some marginal figure, some kind of breakaway group. Actually, at the time, Wright was a senior advisor to the Director General of MI5. That there were 30 case officers working on the thing indicates that it wasn't something which was, a minor aberration of a few hotheads somewhere in MI5, but actually something which they considered to be quite an important operation. Now, let's leave aside the obvious stupidity of the claims about Harold Wilson and ask ourselves, how could it be that they could run such an operation? And if they could run such an operation, then isn't some of the fears of the left, aren't they justified? I think you need to think about the situation first of all in which this was happening, because you're talking about a period now in the early 1970s where the working class had been strong enough to inflict a whole series of really quite serious defeats on the British ruling class. The freeing of the Pentonville dockers by a strike, rolling series of strikes, the two miners' strikes, the second of which, brings down the Heath government. There was a real fear within the British ruling class about what might be about to happen. This is, after all, 1974 is the Christmas where a minister in the Tory government assembles his children and his family and says, let's enjoy this Christmas. This may be the last Christmas that we're able to enjoy. The real fear of the power of the working class. It's a time when the far right in politics are beginning to mobilise. There are innumerable front organisations dedicated to running blacklists of trade union militants. There are a few odd army generals that are willing to talk about forming private armies. Now, I'm not saying that these people obviously aren't the mainstream of ruling class thinking. They aren't the people who've actually got their hands on the levers of power, but they are people. I mean, they exist all the time. But at this point in time, they gained still a minority audience, but a little bit wider audience from a group of people inside the ruling class who thought that possibly they might have to move beyond parliamentary democracy, they might have to move beyond the normal way of running things in order to cope with the threat. Now, as we know, what actually coped with the threat was the Callaghan government. What actually coped with the threat wasn't the security services, wasn't Peter Wright and his happy band of spies, or the few army generals talking about private armies. They weren't the people that actually dealt with it. Actually, the people who did deal with the crisis, with the militancy of the working class, were the Labour government. The very person that Peter Wright thought was a Soviet spy, Harold Wilson, and his successor James Callaghan were actually able to turn aside the tide of those things. But what's important is that they gained, those people, Peter Wright, those people on the far fringes of the ruling class, on the far right wing of the ruling class, only gained a hearing, only began to gain a hearing, only actually became political actors in the marginal sense, when much wider class forces allowed them to do so. It wasn't their Machiavellian organisation, it wasn't their surveillance techniques, it wasn't their spying or their bugging which did it. Actually, because of a much wider and more important balance of class forces, they gained for a brief period a slightly wider hearing. And as soon as the balance of forces changed, as soon as it was clear that the Labour government would turn down the screw on trade union militancy, could come to an agreement with the social contract, would boost unemployment over the 1.5 million mark for the first time, would cut education and welfare spending, that they would deal with the problem, then Peter Wright and his little bunch became outcasts. What angers Wright so much, what drove him to the courts in South Wales, what has driven him to break every single code that he lived by and to expose the secret services, is his anger and disappointment that Margaret Thatcher, who he thought was going to be, who indeed a section inside MI5 had conspired to help become Tory leader, who he thought was one of them, proved to be completely uninterested in Wright and his theories, did all she could to shut up nonsense about Roger Hollis being a spy, that was a class politician who realised what the ruling class needed and realised what it didn't need, that it didn't need somebody like Peter Wright. And so the Wright case, far from proving the all-powerful Machiavellian, power of the Secret Service, proves exactly the opposite. Proves how dispensable they are most of the time for the ruling class. Proves that they can only become a force when much wider, when the much wider balance of class forces, when much more central questions in politics allow them to become so. So really, what's left really about the analysis that the left put forward normally is that they have a fear of the secret services out of all proportion to their real importance in politics. And they have that fear for a simple reason. They have that fear because they believe that the rest of the British state is democratic. They believe that you can change society through Parliament, that it is possible to work with the civil service, that the police constables and the chief police constables will obey you if you're an elected member of Parliament. And therefore, to them, the Secret Service, which is evidently beyond the control, beyond any democratic control, they see them as being villains in a sense which they don't see any other section of the British state being villains. For us, it's different. Actually, the secret state for us is not just the Secret Service, not just the spies, not just the bugging of CND or whatever. Actually, the whole society for us is a secret society. The decisions that are made in the boardrooms of Hovis and Bovis and Shell and Unilever about whether we have jobs, whether we don't, how much will be paid for them, that is secret. What's decided in Whitehall, that is secret. What's decided by the chief constables, that is secret. What's decided by the army generals, that is secret. It's a secret society because the class who control and own this society are a minority class, and therefore they have every interest in maintaining their power and their control. And that tiny, tiny, ineffective part of society that's open to parliamentary elections is insignificant compared with the organised power of the rest of the state machine and the rest of the capitalist class. And we realise that only when you root out that kind of society, that kind of state, will you be able to put an end to the secret service which operates within it. That's why, for us, it's a question of reform or revolution, not of backing them up, not of supporting them, certainly not. Neil Kinnock, the only trouble with Zircon was they should have done it earlier. The only trouble with the right book is they should have banned all the other spy books as well. Not that, not even the left version, which says that they are some particular threat, but actually to see them in the political context of the class system, the class society, the balance of class forces within that society. That is really what's important for us. It's not even particularly important for us that they may operate against our own organisation. Victor Serge, talking about such things at the time of the Russian Revolution, said that really the operations of secret services against communist parties were not something to be particularly bothered about. He said a communist party, even if numerically weak, always, by virtue of its ideology, represents the working class. It incarnates that class consciousness of hundreds of thousands of millions of men. Its role is immense, since it's the role of the brain of the whole nervous system. So that within it, the designs of individuals, when they are not in line with the needs of the party, that is, with the needs of the working class, lose much of their importance. That is, that people, we know that with our own organisation, it's subject to all sorts of pressures, but that we can combat those politically. And Serge goes on to say something which is far more important for us. He says, conversely, individual or collective initiatives which are in line with the needs and aspirations of the party, that is with the working class, acquire their greatest effectiveness within a revolutionary party. For us, the question of the secret service is a question of the hypocrisy of people who say that we live in a democratic society but are constantly exposed by the operations of their own watchdog that they are. That's the importance of it for us. It exposes them. But its real importance in terms of the class struggle is much, much more limited.
I'd first of all like to say I agreed with everything the first two speakers said, with the single exception of when the gentleman said that the Labour Party people lie without batting an eyelid. That's generally true, except in the case of Alistair Darling, who blinks furiously when he when he lies. You may all have seen last night. Now I want to come down to the question of fundamental moral principle, because I also do not hold at all with this idea that we should be having a quiet, civilized debate. And whether you want your country to be independent or not is purely a lifestyle choice, like whether you have milk in your coffee. And when it's all over, we all have to be nice to each other and be terribly pleasant to the traitors in our midst. I don't hold with that at all. And I tell you why. I worked for the British Foreign Office. I became a British ambassador. I was a British diplomat for 20 years. I was always very patriotic to be British. I was very, very proud. I remember when I first became a British ambassador and first went out in my own flag car with the Union Jack flying on the front as the ambassador, I had a lump in my throat. It was a proud moment for me. It was only 6 months after that I discovered that in the country where I was ambassador, we and the Americans were shipping people in order for them to be tortured. And some of them were tortured to death. Now, as you may imagine, my worldview changed. It was at the same time, about a month later, we invaded Iraq against the will of the Security Council. Not just without permission of the Security Council, but in the full knowledge that if it had gone to the Security Council, we would have been voted down. And I, as a British diplomat, saw all the internal memos that went through that decision. I know for certain, I used to be head of the FCO unit that monitored Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And I know for certain, I can tell you, that they knew there weren't any. It wasn't a mistake. It was a lie. I think it is impossible to be proud of the United Kingdom. I think when we invaded Iraq, we did to the United Nations what Hitler and Mussolini did to the League of Nations. And I think what we've done since, where the truth is often much hidden in the bombing. If you look at Libya, disaster now, we bombed it. We killed 15,000 people when NATO bombed Sirte, something they never told you on the BBC. And did we make it better? No. I saw in Uzbekistan, I saw the gas contract signed by Imran and a company called Unocal, which George Bush Sr. was on the board, to dig out gas pipelines from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan over Afghanistan down to the Indian Ocean. That was actually what the Afghan war was about. They'd actually had talks with the Taliban and Unocal to see if the Taliban would provide pipeline security. The person who held those talks was the consultant for Unocal, who's a certain Mr. Karzai, who after being employed by George Bush Sr. as a consultant went on to become president of Afghanistan. That was their plan B. The Taliban wouldn't do it, so they invaded. It usually, I've seen it on the inside, it's almost always about control of resources. It is every bit as corrupt as our first speaker, I'm sorry, I'm also terrible names, indicated. You are absolutely right, Andrew. And I can tell you it's not an academic construct. The system stinks. Westminster stinks. The British government is deeply, deeply immoral. They don't care how many people they kill abroad if it advances them. And anybody who votes no is voting to support a psychologically flawed, a pathological state, which is a danger in the world, a rogue state, a state prepared to go to war to make a few people wealthy. That's why I say it's not possible to be a decent person and vote no, and we shouldn't be ashamed to say that.